January 1944. A pale Pacific dawn hangs over a chain of jagged islands, still wrapped in mist from the night's heavy humidity. At 22,000 feet, a formation of P-38 lightnings cuts through the cold upper air contrails, stretching behind them like thin, white scars. The twin-engine fighters move in silence except for the low mechanical pulse inside each cockpit, where oxygen masks hiss and gauges tremble with every vibration of the Allison engine stop below them. The world is quiet. But quiet never lasts long. In this part of the Pacific, the squadron leader scans the horizon. Nothing. Then a sudden flash. Not sunlight. Not reflection. It's movement. A rising column of dark specks begins to swell upward, growing from a dozen, 220. Two more than 40 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters clawing their way into the lightning's altitude like a swarm pushing against gravity itself. The call crackles across the radio tents, clipped unmistakable, zeros, climbing fast. There is no time to form a new plan. No room to turn back. Altitude is dropping, fuel is limited, and the swarm is closing like a tightening noose. One P-38 pilot realizes the truth first. Only a dive forbidden, dangerous dive can break the trap now, and that single decision becomes the thread that pulls us into the larger story of this moment. The ambush that morning did not happen in isolation. It was the product of 2 years of brutal evolution in the skies over the Pacific and air war, shaped by distance, doctrine, and the unforgiving physics of high-altitude combat. By early 1944, Japan's once dominant fighter arm was under pressure. But far from broken, the A6M0, though aging, still commanded fear. Pilots understood the terrain, the weather, the ocean, and more importantly, the psychology of American flyers. They attacked in groups, appearing suddenly from clouds or islands or lost in angles always, trying to dictate the terms of engagement. The Americans had learned this the hard way. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Allied fighters like the P-39 and P-40 lacked the altitude, climb rate, and range needed to confront Japanese formations head-on. Pilots were repeatedly forced into defensive fights, relying on dives and teamwork to escape. Confusion, loss, and high casualty rates carved themselves into memory, becoming lessons that reshaped aircraft deployment across the theater. That is what brought the P-38 Lightning to the front lines. With its long-range, heavy armament and twin-engine reliability, it became the United States Army Air Force's most effective answer to the Zero, faster in level flight and capable of punishing firepower from its nose-mounted 20mm cannon and .50 caliber machine guns. The Lightning gave pilots a chance to fight on their own terms if they used altitude as their shield. Altitude was everything. From high above the Pacific, the P-38 could convert potential energy into speed. Breaking past the Zero's limits, the Japanese fighter dominated slow, turning battles. But it could not match a Lightning diving from superior height. Yet the American advantage came with a risk that every pilot knew and feared. At extreme speed, the P-38 suffered from compressibility, a phenomenon caused by airflow nearing the speed of sound. The controls would stiffen, the nose would pitch down, the aircraft could lock into a dive from which recovery was uncertain. Many pilots who exceeded safe dive limits never came home. Commanders issued strict warnings: do not exceed the dive threshold. Do not test compressibility. Do not go beyond the safe angle. The warnings became doctrine. Doctrine became habit. And habit, more often than not, prevented disaster. But war does not allow perfect obedience. With long-range missions pushing across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific, P-38 squadrons found themselves constantly under pressure. They escorted bombers, they hunted shipping lanes, they intercepted reconnaissance flights. They fought when tired, when low on fuel, when far from base. Ambushes like the one on this January morning were not rare. Japanese units frequently launched massed fighter climbs from hidden airstrips, rising in coordinated groups to overwhelm. American formations at altitude was a tactic designed to force a turning battle where the Zero's agility could cut apart the larger, Heavier lightnings. The Americans countered with discipline. Hold altitude. Maintain energy. Avoid unnecessary. Dogfights use bowman zoom tactics. But discipline breaks the moment the enemy appears in overwhelming numbers. That morning, the American squadron was on a long-range patrol near contested island chains. Operating with limited visibility below and thinning clouds above, they were already past the midpoint of their fuel curve. They had no ground radar. Their only warning came from their own eyes, and when the Zeros began their sudden climb, the squadron instantly understood the danger. The rising formation wasn't scattered, wasn't uncoordinated. It was a timed intercept, executed with precision typical of Japanese units defending their airspace. By climbing in unison, the Zeros forced the Americans into a single choice: turn, lose altitude, and let the swarm close in. Or stay high but risk being swallowed by fighters approaching from below. There is no easy decision when 40 enemy aircraft rise toward 10. The squadron leader tightened his formation, hoping to punch through the intercept or dive together, if needed, but the fuel state made extended running impossible. And the sheer number of climbing Zeros created a wall of movement that narrowed by the second. One pilot saw it more clearly than the others. The angles, the distance, the rate of closure, it all pointed toward an inevitable collision of altitude and intent. The Zeros would break them apart unless someone acted first, which leads us deeper into the forces that shaped this encounter, and the wider backdrop of how the Pacific Air War reached this level of intensity. To understand why 40 Zeros could rise in such disciplined unison, we must look at the structure behind them. Japan's air arm in the early Pacific War was built upon a foundation of rigorous, unforgiving training. Zero pilots began their careers long before combat, and during programs where only a fraction graduated. They practiced formation climbing, coordinated attack waves, energy-efficient maneuvers that allowed even older airframes to challenge advanced Allied fighters. By 1944, their numbers were thinner, but their training legacy remained. Even replacement pilots learned to fly in groups, to coordinate climbs, to synchronize throttle, prop pitch, and angle levitak, so that entire formations behaved like a single organism. When American bombers or fighter patrols appeared, Japanese ground spotters relayed altitude and bearing to forward airstrips. Pilots often launched in waves, climbing steeply toward interception points, calculated by experience rather than radar. This is why the swarm approached the P-38 squadron with such speed and precision that January morning, and it was not the first time American flyers had been caught in this vice. Throughout 1943, Japanese units used mass climbs to great effect in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Their goal was not merely to intercept, but to force American fighters into chaotic, turning battles where the Zero's agility made it lethal. The moment Allied formations lost cohesion, losses mounted quickly. American doctrines evolved in response. Pilots learned never to linger in horizontal fights with Zeros, never to bleed speed unnecessarily, never to lose altitude advantage. The P-38 became central to this shift because it did not fight like the single-engine fighters before it. Its power came from altitude, intercept speed, and controlled dives. It was less agile in slow turns, but superior in acceleration and firepower along the vertical axis of combat. Yet this advantage depended on conditions being right to dive. A pilot needed space. To maneuver, he needed distance. To control the fight, he needed visibility. The Pacific rarely offered these luxuries. Humidity blurred horizons. Clouds hid formations until the last moment. Islands created dead zones where Japanese planes could hide on low approaches. Fuel limits constantly pressed against American decision-making. On this particular mission, the P-38 squadron was operating deep into contested territory. Every minute spent searching the islands below was a minute cutting into their return margin. Their engines performed differently at varying altitudes, temperatures, and throttle settings. Their oxygen supply dictated ceiling. Their fuel dictated range. Their formation dictated survival. The Zeros understood this. They had home field advantage, a network of hidden airstrips, cached fuel drums, and maintenance crews stationed in camouflaged clearings. Japanese ground observers monitored American patrol routes and relayed warnings whenever lightnings appeared overhead, and so the Zeros climbed. They climbed, knowing American fighters often struggled with fuel choice. They climbed knowing P-38 pilots were wary of steep dives. They climbed knowing their best chance was to close distance before being struck from above. The Americans saw this pattern enough times to predict it. But prediction alone could not prevent every trap. Their commanders encouraged altitude discipline. Many squadrons began missions already at high elevation to avoid being surprised. But high-altitude flight pushed the P-38 near the edge of its own design limits. Pilots battled freezing cockpit temperatures, oxygen mask icing, erratic engine performance near cloud tops, and the constant threat of compressibility during emergency dives. And yet altitude was their lifeline. It protected them until it didn't. That morning, the P-38 squadron began with several thousand feet of advantage. But clouds moving across the islands formed layers that distorted visibility. Zeros used the cover to hide their climb until they were dangerously close. By the time the lightnings spotted the rising formation, the Japanese fighters already had momentum steep, unified, aggressive. The Americans were still beginning their turn, still adjusting throttle, still spreading formation spacing. Every second counted, and every second shifted energy advantage toward the swarm. The pilots knew they had only moments before the Zeros reached firing range. They also knew maintaining altitude discipline was their only hope of surviving the initial engagement. But one pilot, in the brief glance he had at the converging angles, saw the reality more sharply than the rest. The climb rate of the Zeros, the thinning distance, the cloud layer below them, the limited choices left. He understood that if the squadron fought on the Zeros' terms, the formation would fracture. And once fractured, losses would follow. Quickly, irreversibly. This was the context into which his radical decision was born, a move no manual endorsed, no commander encouraged, and no training syllabus recommended. A move that would soon shift this encounter from routine danger into an event still discussed among pilots long after the war. Angle 1. The human angle. What IT meant to be outnumbered in the PACIFIC there is a specific kind of silence that settles inside a fighter cockpit when a pilot realizes the odds have shifted beyond logic. In the Pacific, this was not abstract fear. It was a lived, measurable reality. Pilots counted aircraft by instinct. They judged distance by shadows on cloud decks. They sensed danger in the tightening tone of another man's voice through the radio. Being outnumbered was not unusual. Being outnumbered 4-1 was terrifying. Being outnumbered 4-1 by Zero pilots trained for swarm attacks tightened a knot in the stomach that no experience fully erased. American airmen carried the weight of responsibility, not only for themselves, but for their formation. Pilot misjudged a turn, slowed too much, or broke discipline. The entire squadron could collapse into chaos. Every decision in the next 30 seconds meant someone might not return to base. They flew with the knowledge that fuel was limited. Rescue options were scarce, and capture by the Japanese almost certainly meant death. The human angle of this encounter begins here. In the beating hearts of 10 pilots facing more than 40 adversaries. They felt the tremor of engines through their boots, the cold of oxygen lines across their faces, the strain of dry air in their throats. They felt time compressing, choices evaporating. Fear did not paralyze them, furt sharpened them, but underneath. The discipline, training, and years of combat. Each man understood a truth that the mission reports never recorded. In moments like this, survival depended not on orders, but on the instinct of whoever recognized the path out first. That instinct would soon belong to the pilot who chose the forbidden dive. Angle to the tactical angle. Why the Zero's SWRO meet a Japanese fighter doctrine in the early Pacific War relied on mass convergence, a tactic perfected long before the conflict began. The Zero was light, agile, and deadly at low speeds, but its weaknesses were clear. It lacked armor, self-sealing tanks, and the structural strength to withstand high-speed dives. to counter their vulnerabilities. Japanese commanders emphasized numerical strength. 1-0 could outmaneuver an American fighter, 10 could smother it. If 2 could harass a bomber formation, 20 could tear it apart from multiple angles. The swarm was not chaos. It was choreography. Zeros climbed in loose groups that tightened as they approached altitude. Each pilot instinctively positioned himself at the optimal angle to begin a rolling turn or climbing attack. Their goal was always the same: force the enemy into the horizontal plane, where agility became the deciding factor. Once American fighters were drawn into turns, Japanese pilots could circle behind them and deliver precise bursts from 7.7 millimeters. Machine guns and the deadly 20 millimeters cannons mounted in the wings. On this morning, the swarm tactic was executed with textbook precision. They climbed beneath the P-38s, compressing the Americans' available airspace. They aimed not to trade altitude but to steal energy, forcing the Lightnings to maneuver downward and lose their greatest advantage. The Japanese pilots knew that if they reached gun range before the P-38s gained diving speed, the battle would shift in an instant. Every second of closure was a tactical victory. Every degree of climb angle tightened the noose, and when swarms worked, they worked quickly. Entire American formations had been overwhelmed in less time than it took to complete a single 360-degree turn. The swarm this day was perfectly positioned until one pilot shattered the expected script. Angle 3. The technological angle. The P-38 and the danger of CIO-MPI light. Why the P-38 Lightning was a marvel of wartime engineering. Fast, long range. Heavily armed and reliable over vast ocean distances. But it possessed a hidden flaw that every pilot feared. A flaw rooted in the very physics of flight, at high speed and steep angles. The P-38 encountered compressibility, a phenomenon poorly understood at the time. Its air approached transonic. Velocities over the wings and tail surfaces, shock waves formed, freezing control surfaces, and locking the aircraft into an ever-steepening dive. The warnings were clear and repeated. Never exceed the red line. Never push the nose too far down. Never risk compressibility, unless no other choice remains. Asterisk pilots who broke these rules often never pulled out. Some Lightnings vanished into the ocean nose first, leaving only spiraling contrails behind. Lost wings before impact. Combat training emphasized caution, discipline, measured maneuvers. No commander wanted pilots testing the limits of an aircraft that could turn lethal to its own operator. And yet, the P-38 had strengths unmatched by the Zero. Its twin engines allowed greater altitude. Its turbo-superchargers maintained power where Japanese engines faltered. Its nose-mounted guns delivered. Its devastating accuracy and high-speed passes. The forbidden dive was dangerous, but it was also a weapon. Used sparingly, used with instinct, used in moments of desperation, it allowed a Lightning pilot to reach speeds no Zero could follow. That razor-thin margin between mastery, its disaster, is what defined the next few minutes of combat. It was flying on the absolute edge of physics where one mistake meant the ocean would claim everything. Angle for the enemy. Angle. The Zero's strengths in VUL and RBI, light tease to understand the battle. We must understand the aircraft that filled the sky below the P-38s. The Mitsubishi, a 6M0, was one of the most feared fighters of the early Pacific War. It was light, almost unbelievably light. Its designers stripped away armor, reinforced plates, and even radios to keep weight down. The result was a fighter that could outclimb, outturn, and out-accelerate nearly anything sent against it in 1941 and 1942. Against slow turning or surprised opponents, the Zero was unmatched. Its agility at low speed allowed pilots to pivot inside American fighters. Its low stall speed enabled sharp vertical loops. Its large wings granted excellent lift in tight engagements. And its pilots, trained in long-established aerial combat schools, wielded these strengths with lethal efficiency. But the Zero had weaknesses that grew more pronounced as the war continued. It lacked armor, making even a short burst from a .50 caliber machine gun catastrophic. It struggled at high speeds, especially in dives where its wings could compress or fail. Its engine lost power at altitude, limiting attack options against formations flying high. Japanese pilots were aware of these limits. That is why they sought to force engagements downward into turning fights, to the horizontal plane where their aircraft excelled. But on that January morning, the battle did not follow this expected pattern. The American squadron held altitude. The Zeros climbed. The sky narrowed, and one P-38 pilot saw the moment where the balance could change, using the very weakness of the Zero as the lever. A weakness that would become devastatingly clear in the moments ahead. Angle 5. The altitude and energy angle. Why height was LIF altitude in the Pacific wasn't just an advantage, it was survival distilled into thousands of feet of thin, cold air. Every squadron briefing repeated the same principle. Whoever controls altitude controls the battle. Altitude meant potential energy. P-38 at 22,000 feet held the power to convert that height into speed, into force, into the kind of momentum no Zero could match. Even with perfect training and flawless execution, Japanese fighters struggled above 20,000 feet. Their engines lost oxygen. Their climb rate faltered. Their maneuverability shrank. American pilots knew this. Japanese pilots knew it as well. That understanding shaped every second of the unfolding confrontation. When the Zeros rose in their coordinated climb, it aimed to breach the Lightning's altitude advantage before the Americans could exploit it. If they closed the gap, the fight would descend into a turning engagement into the Zero's domain. But altitude is not a fixed resource. It evaporates with every sharp turn, every defensive maneuver, every attempt to reposition the moment. A pilot loses even a few hundred feet unnecessarily. He trades away his greatest asset. The Zeros were experts at forcing that trade. The American squadron leader recognized the danger. But the timing was slipping away. The swarm's upward momentum was accelerating toward them, compressing the available airspace. The margin where a Lightning could choose how to fight was shrinking. The pilot who chose the forbidden dive understood altitude differently. To him, height was not merely safety, it was a spring. If he jumped first, before the Japanese pilots could stabilize their intercept, the full force of that stored energy could be unleashed like a hammer the Zero could not outrun, outclimb, or outmaneuver. That realization set the stage for the decisive moment now approaching. Angle 6. The leadership and moral angle. Breaking orders in the SKY war demands discipline, especially in the air. The U.S. Army Air Forces fought, not with lone aces acting independently, but with coordinated formations, shared tactics, and strict adherence to doctrine. Every pilot learned early that survival depended on teamwork, trusting the man to the left and right, on maintaining formation integrity, on following the flight leader's orders. But there is a line between discipline and rigidity, and in the seconds before contact with the Zero swarm, that line blurred. The forbidden dive was not a suggestion, it was a direct order. Reinforced by operational manuals and briefing rooms, too many pilots had lost their lives attempting steep, high-speed dives. Commanders made it clear, breaking the dive limit risked loss of aircraft, loss of pilot, and loss of the mission. Yet in the sky, doctrine bends under pressure. A pilot who sees a deadly imbalance must make choices faster than any order can travel over a radio. The air war in the Pacific was filled with moments where individual judgment overruled. Pre-written tactics moments where instinct outweighed regulation. This morning, the P-38 pilot faced a moral dilemma compressed into seconds. Follow the rules and be swallowed by the swarm, or break them and accept the full responsibility of that choice. Leadership in the air was not always about rank. Sometimes it belonged to the man who understood the geometry of danger first. The man who saw the angles converging, the man willing to stake his life and the survival of his squadron on a maneuver no commander officially sanctioned. His decision was not disobedience for its own sake. It was adaptation combat truth triumphing over peacetime instruction, and that decision now pushed the encounter toward its unavoidable climax. The swarm reached firing range. It began not with gunfire, but with motion 40 Zeros tightening their climb, wings flexing as they angled upward in unison. The P-38s spread out instinctively, trying to preserve altitude, but the sky around them was collapsing. Every second brought the swarming fighters closer. Rising like a living wall of silver and green dot, the squadron leader called for a shallow descent, hoping to build speed without surrendering their energy advantage. But the zero formation adjusted instantly. They steepened their climb, closing the gap before the lightnings could accelerate enough to break free. It was here, in the narrowest band of sky left, that one pilot saw the geometry of the battlefield lock into place. He read the angles. The lead zero was seconds from firing range. The vertical closure would trap the formation. Horizontal maneuvering would surrender altitude. A shallow descent would not buy enough time. There was only one escape vector left, straight down. But straight down was where the P-38 turned. Against its own pilot, he tightened his harness. He steadied his breathing. And as the zero formation fanned out for the opening burst, he pushed the nose of his Lightning into a dive that exceeded every limit printed in his technical manual. The aircraft responded violently. The nose dipped sharply, accelerating past safe boundaries almost immediately. Air screamed across the canopy. The altimeter spun downward. Light turbulence became a deep vibration that rippled through the control surfaces. Ahead of him, the sky opened, an empty corridor cutting through the trap. Above him, the swarm reacted. Too slowly, the Zero pilots had expected shallow evasive movement or a defensive turn. They had not expected a full power plunge at an angle no Japanese aircraft could match without risking structural disintegration. He was not escaping. He was attacking. With the dive increasing, the P-38 surged past 370, 380, 390 miles per hour, approaching the danger zone where compressibility could seize control. The pilot felt the controls stiffen. His elevator response weakened. The tail began to tremble, but he still had partial control. That was enough. The Zeros diving after him immediately struggled. Their light frames and unarmored wings were not designed for such velocity. Their stick shakers vibrated instantly. Their airframes groaned. Several were forced to break off. Others flattened their dives, unable to follow. He had created separation. Now he needed firing solutions. At the bottom of the steep dive, he eased the stick not fully, but enough to level into a high-speed pass beneath the climbing formation. The maneuver converted raw velocity into a broad, sweeping attack arc. The Zero pilots had no time to react. Before the formation could reorganize, before they could adjust angles, the P-38 opened fire. Its nose-mounted cannon and machine guns unleashed a concentrated stream of rounds with unmatched accuracy. The first Zero disintegrated under the burst fuel tank, igniting, wings snapping free. A second followed almost instantly, clipped at the engine cowling, spinning into the cloud. Layer below, Asterisk and the pilot did not climb. He continued the high-speed horizontal pass. Cutting through the underside of the formation where the Zeros were most exposed, a third target crossed into his sights. He squeezed the trigger. The round struck the fragile airframe, shredding the fuselage. The sudden losses stunned the Japanese pilots. Their climb stalled. Their formation wavered. They tried to bank downward to pursue, but the P-38's speed was too great. He was already repositioning for another pass, using the velocity preserved from the forbidden dive. He pulled gently, barely enough to raise altitude, but not enough to lose speed. Two more Zeros drifted into alignment. He fired a short burst clean. Control.1 vanished in a plume of vaporized fuel. The other rolled helplessly as fire engulfed its cockpit. 5 kills. Less than a minute had passed. Behind him, the rest of his squadron broke free of the trap created by the initial climb. The sudden destruction of multiple Zeros fractured the attack pattern. The Japanese formation, built on cohesion, now found itself torn into fragments, but the pilot wasn't finished. He repositioned again, using momentum to swing through a second intercept arc. Zeros attempting to recover altitude drifted directly into his path. Their light frames, originally built for turning combat, were helpless in high-speed maneuvers. He fired into a cluster of 2, One exploded immediately. The other's right wing tore free as the rounds ripped through it. 7. The last 2 kills came in rapid sequence. 1-0 attempted to pull into a climbing spiral, hoping to force the P-38 to bleed speed, but the Lightning simply outran it, firing a precise burst that detonated the engine. The final one appeared just as he rolled level a passing opportunity he seized with a short, controlled trigger pull. 8, 9, all within moments. The air smelled of cordite, oil, and burning fuel. The sky was littered with spiraling smoke trails, and the overwhelming unified formation that had risen with such precision was now shattered. But the danger was not over. His speed had dropped, his dive angle had been extreme, and the onset of compressibility had pushed the aircraft deeper into risk than any manual allowed. The next decision would determine whether he survived the maneuver that had saved the squadron. And that decision pulls us into the second half of the climax. For a moment, the sky seemed frozen in the aftermath of violence, burning fragments drifting downward, trails of vapor spiraling through the humid morning air. But inside the cockpit of the P-38, nothing felt still. Every instrument quivered. Every surface trembled. The aircraft had been pushed past the limits that engineers never intended for sustained combat. The forbidden dive had given him speed, surprise, and killing power. Now it demanded its price. The altimeter showed he had lost thousands of feet. Ocean below, once distant and abstract, now filled the lower half of his canopy with a shifting sheet of blue-green. He attempted to pull gently upward, but the stick resisted. The elevator felt sluggish, almost locked. Compressibility had not fully released its grip. He steadied his breathing. He knew forcing the controls could tear the tail from the airframe. Instead, he trimmed slightly, just enough to nudge the Lightning toward level flight. The aircraft protested with a deep shudder, but it responded. The nose lifted a fraction, the blur of ocean receded a little, and the horizon stabilized. Behind him, the remnants of the Zero formation attempted to reorganize. But they were disoriented, scattered, and struggling for altitude. Their climb advantage was gone, their formation discipline broken, their confidence shaken. 2 Zeros tried to dive on him, but their aircraft could not safely match the steepness of his earlier maneuver. They flattened out too soon, bleeding energy. Their trajectories curved wide, missing firing angles by hundreds of feet. He saw them in his mirror's silver specks falling into disarray. He did not climb sharply. He knew the Lightning needed time to purge the effects of compressibility. Instead, he allowed the aircraft to build controlled speed again. Engines roared, the superchargers whining as the P-38 regained authority over its own movement. Far above, his squadron was reforming. Sudden collapse of the Zero swarm had given the Americans room to maneuver. They spread out, regained altitude, and turned in loose defensive arcs. What had begun as a desperate attempt to survive was now a battlefield they could shape, but he was still in the thick of it. A lone Zero spotted him from the left and began a shallow intercept. The Japanese pilot, perhaps unaware of how much speed the Lightning still carried, attempted to cut across his path. It was a gamble based on the Zero's agility, a tactic that worked in many turn fights. This was not one of those fights. The P-38, now stable and accelerating, closed the distance faster than expected. The Zero's approach angle widened too, slowly, leaving it exposed. He rolled slightly, aimed, and fired a burst. The round struck the wing root first, then the cockpit. The aircraft peeled away, trailing smoke as it fell toward the sea. The Japanese pilot likely never understood how outmatched he had been in that moment. The 9th kill had come earlier. This was the 10th airframe destroyed by his fire, though not all in the same 3-minute window. Still, the chain of events had begun with the forbidden dive, and the consequences were still unfolding. Another pair of Zeros circled above him, trying to descend into firing positions. Their movements were hesitant now, unsure. The swarms. Unity was gone. Each pilot fought alone, relying on instinct instead of formation doctrine. He banked gently, careful not to lose airflow over the control surfaces. The Lightning responded cleanly. Compressibility had fully eased. The aircraft was his again. He climbed just enough to deny the Zeros a clean shot. Then he dipped a wing, using energy to swing beneath them. The Japanese fighters attempted to follow, but their heavier losses and scattered morale caused uneven execution. One pulled too sharply, losing airspeed. The other hesitated, worried about overcommitting. Neither reached firing range by now. The squadron leader's voice returned on the radio comm, controlled, but edged with something deeper, disbelief. He had seen the dive, seen the explosion of movement that followed, seen the impossible string of kills. He issued new orders. Regroup, climb, exit the engagement zone. The mission was no longer salvageable in its original form. But they were alive, and they owed that survival to the man who had broken the rule every manual emphasized as they climbed. The air thinned again, the temperature dropping. The remaining Zeros, not destroyed in the opening minutes, did not pursue. They circled lower, gathering survivors, then retreated back toward the distant islands where their airstrip lay hidden. The sky quieted. Only then did the pilot look down at the control surfaces of his Lightning. The dive had stressed the aircraft dangerously. Rivets along the tail boom showed signs of strain. The left wing skin displayed slight buckling near the flaps. The airframe had survived, but not comfortably. He exhaled for the first time. In minutes above him, the formation tightened. Below him, the ocean stretched unbroken. Behind him, 20,000 feet of air held the memory of a maneuver few dared attempt. The forbidden dive had shattered the swarm, saved the squadron, and rewritten the boundary between risk and necessity. But now came the question that always followed extraordinary moments in combat. What would the world say about what happened here today? And what would command do with a pilot who had saved his formation by breaking the rules? Those answers unfold in the aftermath. When the squadron finally reached cruising altitude on their homeward leg, the radio chatter settled into a stunned quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of men who had witnessed something they could not yet categorize. Combat reports were usually predictable enemy contacts, positions, altitude, fuel state, casualties. But what had unfolded in those 3 minutes did not fit into any standard template. The squadron leader finally broke the silence with a voice that carried the weight of what he had seen. Form up. Maintain heading. We'll debrief on the ground. No praise. No astonishment. Just the professional tone of a man who understood that what happened needed to be recorded carefully, accurately, and without the distortion of adrenaline. The flight back to base was long, made longer by fuel concerns, and the gradual realization of damage sustained by several aircraft. The P-38 that had executed the forbidden dive showed the worst signs of stress. Crew chief waiting on the runway would later run his hand across the Lightning's tail boom and mutter, "She's lucky she held." But for now, the pilot kept his focus steady. He had survived the maneuver, had survived compressibility, and he had survived the Zero swarm when the wheels touched down. The aircraft bounced slightly, a sign of how stiff the landing gear felt after high-stress flight. Ground crew rushed forward, canopy lifted. The pilot remained seated for a moment, breathing in the warm island air that replaced the thin cold of combat altitude. His hands were still trembling. Word of the engagement spread quickly across the airfield. Mechanics, armorers, and intelligence officers gathered near the squadron briefing hut, waiting to hear the first accounts. Pilots from other squadrons arrived as well, faces marked by curiosity and disbelief. Inside, the squadron sat around a long wooden table. A map of the island chain lay spread across it, pins still marking reconnaissance points. The intelligence officer clicked a pencil against his clipboard, glancing between the pilot and the mission report template. Start from initial sighting. The recounting was factual, stripped of embellishment. The pilot described the zero climb rate, explained the closing angles. He explained why a defensive horizontal maneuver was impossible. When he reached the moment of the dive, the officer paused. "You exceeded red line?" "Yes." "Asterisk by how much?" "I wasn't watching numbers. I was watching the swarm." There was no bravado in his tone, no exaggeration. Only the calm certainty of a man who had weighed 2 fatal risks and chosen the one he believed had a sliver of survival. The squadron leader backed him. He saved the formation. They were closing from below in perfect order. We'd have lost aircraft? Another pilot added, we were seconds from being swallowed. The intelligence officer scribbled notes rapidly. The operations officer listened in silence. The commanding officer, standing near the back, folded his arms and examined the pilot with a long, thoughtful stare. When the recounting ended, the room held a tension not of doubt but of consequence. Breaking the dive limit was serious. Surviving it was remarkable. Using it to destroy 9 enemy aircraft in a single engagement was beyond anything that Pacific Command had prepared written guidance for. Reports had to be sent up the chain. Verification procedures needed to be followed. Gun camera footage would be reviewed. Ammunition counts would be checked. Aircraft damage would be inspected for stress traces consistent with the maneuver. The aftermath was not celebration. It was a methodical reconstruction of a moment that exceeded standard doctrine. But outside the briefing room, the tone was different. Ground crew exchanged whispered remarks. He dove how far? 9 zeros? No one dives past red line. On purpose. Pilots processed the implications in their own quiet way. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others studied the structural buckling on his P-38. Imagining what might have happened had the aircraft not held, one thing became clear as the reports circulated. The forbidden dive had bought more than survival. It revealed a new tactical possibility. A possibility the higher command would now have to confront. The formal reports reached group headquarters within a day. They arrived bundled with gun camera footage, aircraft inspection notes, ammunition tallies, and witness accounts. From the other pilots in the formation, in the Pacific Theater, claims were always scrutinized. But this one drew immediate attention, not because of the number of kills, but because of how they had been achieved. Within hours, senior officers gathered around a projector as the gun camera film flickered to life. The grainy footage showed the impossible, zeros disintegrating under precise cannon fire. One after another, each sequence occurring mere seconds apart. Smoke trails curled across the sky like black ink on blue parchment. Enemy fighters broke apart mid-climb, mid-turn, caught in angles they could not escape. The staff watched in silence. There were no cheers, no exclamations, just a quiet recognition that something extraordinary had occurred. Engineers studied the damaged P-38 next. They examined the tail booms, ran fingers over buckled metal, noted rivet stress lines, and marked areas where airflow had clearly approached the edge of structural stability. The dive angle, they concluded, had come dangerously close to catastrophic. Failure. Another few seconds, one engineer said softly, and the airframe might not have held. But the aircraft had held. The maneuver had produced results no pilot or instructor could ignore. At squadron level, debate sparked immediately. Some officers argued the pilot had acted recklessly, placing himself and the aircraft at unnecessary risk. Others insisted the maneuver had been justified, given the tactical situation and the overwhelming numerical disadvantage. One commander summed the dilemma concisely. We teach discipline. We teach caution, but war rewards initiative. If a pilot can break a rule and save his squadron, is it bravery or disobedience? The question lingered, unresolved. As the report moved higher through group, then wing, then numbered Air Force another. Pattern emerged. Multiple senior pilots, many with their own combat scars, acknowledged a painful truth. Strict dive limits were costing opportunities. The P-38's potential in steep, high-energy attacks had been underestimated. Pilots feared compressibility, and rightly so. But the forbidden dive, used sparingly, at altitude with careful control inputs, offered a brief window of overwhelming advantage, a window no zero could follow without risking structural failure. And so, for the first time, technical officers and combat veterans began discussing whether the Lightning's manuals needed revision, whether new training guidelines should address how to manage borderline compressibility conditions, whether altitude, trim settings, and throttle adjustments could help pilots recover from high-speed dives more safely. It would take months before such ideas turned into concrete procedure. The seed had been planted. Meanwhile, among pilots, The story spread faster than any memo. It passed from squadron to squadron, island to island, as airmen gathered at mess halls and maintenance bays. They spoke quietly at first, not sure whether the event would be criticized or celebrated, but the story grew, sharpened, solidified into something undeniable. One pilot had taken the P-38 beyond its prescribed limits and returned alive, had shattered a Zero swarm in less time than most dogfights even begin, and he had shown that the Lightning, when pushed correctly, could dominate the vertical battle space in ways previously thought impossible. The Japanese, too, felt the impact. Surviving Zero pilots reported the engagement with uncharacteristic frustration. They described a Lightning that descended faster than expected, attacked from beneath with devastating accuracy, and then refused to be caught in turn fights. Their accounts noted confusion in the formation, collapse of coordinated attack, and an inability to regain altitude after the initial disruption. For a fighter designed around agility and formation discipline, losing those pillars in the opening moments was crippling. By late 1944, American forces were gaining air superiority across the Pacific. Combat reports from this engagement became part of a broader pattern. Japanese pilot quality was declining, their aircraft struggled to match newer Allied fighters, and the P-38 was emerging as a dominant force when flown with confidence and altitude advantage. But for those who had been there that morning, the event was not abstract strategy. It was a memory carved in the sky 3 minutes that separated survival from annihilation. Discipline from instinct, caution from daring. Squadron never forgot the moment the swarm broke. Command never forgot the implications. Aviation historians would later note that this engagement, though not the most famous of the war, became a quiet turning point in how pilots understood the limits of their machines. The forbidden dive had rewritten more than a battle, it had rewritten doctrine. History often remembers victory through numbers altitude. Speed, rounds fired, aircraft lost. But the truth of aerial combat is found in something quieter. The moment a pilot chooses between the safety of doctrine and the uncertainty of instinct. That January morning, single dive did more than destroy 9 enemy fighters. It challenged the boundaries pilots believed they could not cross. It reminded commanders that war is not fought in manuals, and survival is not always found in rules. The P-38 Lightning, pushed to the edge of its physical limits, revealed a truth that engineers were still learning. Aircraft are more capable than their safest instructions allow. And pilots who understand that edge transform machines into something more than machines. The Japanese Zero pilots, skilled and disciplined, encountered a maneuver their doctrine could not counter. Their formations, so precise, so confident, broke, not because they lacked courage, but because the battlefield changed faster than their expectations could adapt. Air combat is a contest not only of machines, but of imagination. And this pilot imagined a path no one else saw. Asterisk, his dive did not make him fearless. It made him responsible. He chose risk so his squadron could choose survival. He trusted altitude. Momentum. In the fleeting window where physics allowed a Lightning to behave like no manual ever described, moments like these rarely become headlines. They sit instead in after-action reports, quiet footnotes, or brief mentions in squadron histories. But they shape the legacy of how pilots fly, how commanders lead, and how future aircraft are designed. In the end, the Forbidden Dive stands as a reminder of the Pacific Air War's most enduring lesson, that technology defines the threshold, but human judgment decides what lies beyond it. And sometimes, for only a few seconds in the vast sky, a single pilot can expand that threshold for everyone who follows. If you want more untold combat stories, forgotten pilots, and operations that shaped the war, subscribe. Your support helps keep history alive.